Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started because it's 10 a.m. I'm Lisa Fairbairn. I am the Dean of the Graduate School, and it is a pleasure to welcome you all, students, faculty, friends of Northwood, whether you're joining us in person or virtually as we kick off Northwood's celebration of America's 250th anniversary. We begin today with the Freedom Lights the Future Festival, which is a day-long experience that reflects both our nation's founding ideals and Northwood's commitment to advancing them. Throughout the day, our campus will come alive from this opening panel to a curated museum exhibit along the Mall Walk in Four Seasons. There'll be historical reenactors, there'll be student pop-up competitions, and this evening will culminate with a free concert that you'll hear more about later. But we begin this morning where it all began with ideas. Today's conversation will focus on what the ideas from the Declaration mean, how they've shaped our nation, and why they remain essential in our dialogue today, especially as we develop the leaders here at Northwood University. So you're in for truly engaging conversation with our esteemed faculty. Dr. Moeller and Ben Zachary have assembled a distinguished panel of scholars to help bring to life the meaning, relevance, and enduring impact of the Declaration of Independence and how it has helped shape our great country. And our discussion will be moderated by Dr. Dale Matcheck. He's professor of economics and department chair. He has been a cornerstone here at Northwood University for 30 years. He is co-editor of When We Are Free. He has been director of the Freedom Seminar from 1999 all the way till 2022, which is a huge undertaking that we are so grateful for. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Matcheck, who will be introducing the panel and will be our moderator. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Matcheck.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, welcome everybody. So as Dr. Fairbairn said, we are celebrating our 250th anniversary as a nation. We date the founding of the nation from the signing of this document, the Declaration of Independence. Many people get a little bit fuzzy about the difference between the Declaration, the Constitution, so I wanted to state some simple distinctions. The Declaration established the ends of our government. The Constitution establishes the means by which those will be pursued. So the Constitution was provisional by design. It can be changed as circumstances warrant. The Declaration is different. It was meant to be a statement of timeless principles that do not change. And so as the country has matured, as each generation succeeds another, how have those principles shaped our institutions? How have they changed the way our politics, our economics, our culture has developed? It's been called the American Creed, the beliefs that hold us together as a nation. As Margaret Thatcher put it, England is a product of history, but America is a product of philosophy. So here we are, 250 years later. Those ideas have been tried and tested through civil war, economic transformation, social conflict. How have they influenced us? How have they served us? And how do they continue to serve us today? We are going to explore those questions with our distinguished panel. Let me introduce them to you now, starting with Dr. Glenn Moots, who's on the far left of me, your right. Dr. Moots is professor and chair of political science and philosophy at Northwood University. He's been a visiting fellow at Princeton University and the Huntington Library, has received research support from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, the Acton Institute, and the Institute for Humane Studies. He's published almost 24 chapters in edited volumes in academic journals and authored over 100 occasional and review essays in popular and academic online and print publications. He received his PhD in political science, his master's in political science, and master's in philosophy from Louisiana State University, his master's in financial economics from Walsh College, and his bachelor's in Asian studies and political science from the University of Michigan. Please welcome Dr. Moots. Dr. Michael Makovi received his PhD in agricultural and applied economics from Texas Tech University in 2020. And since then, he has served as assistant professor of economics here at Northwood University. He has published in many prestigious economics journals, and his research examines the foundations of economic thought, including the intriguing question of why Karl Marx's economic ideas remain popular despite their broad rejection by professional economists. Please welcome Dr. Michael Makovi. Brett Decker, nearest to me, holds the endowed chair of leadership at Northwood University. He is a New York Times best-selling author. He has served as editorial page editor of the Washington Times and Asian culture and thought editor at the Wall Street Journal. He has written for 2 U.S. presidents, and his commentary was recognized by the BBC as among the world's best. He received the Amnesty International Award for Human Rights Reporting. Outside of journalism, he has worked in the leadership of the U.S. Congress and written for 2 U.S. presidents, as I mentioned. He was senior vice president at the Export-Import Bank of the United States and the Pentagon Federal Credit Union. He holds degrees from Albion College, Johns Hopkins, Notre Dame, U.S. Naval War College, and the University of Southern California. He's currently working on another degree from Harvard, so a busy guy. You may have seen Dr. Nash was meant to have joined us this morning, but he contacted us with his regrets. He was feeling under the weather. So we certainly send our best wishes to him for feeling better soon. But in the meantime, I will be posing questions and inviting the panelists to respond to these questions as they see fit. So please welcome Brett Decker, and we'll get started. Okay. I guess let's go in order. Let's start with Dr. Moots, and then we'll proceed through the line. First question. The Declaration says that equality and the right to liberty were self-evident truths. What does this mean? Why these words?
Thank you, Dale. And can you hear me okay? Okay. Thanks, Dale, for leading this, and to our organizers, and thanks to all of you for being here to celebrate the occasion of the Declaration of Independence. I don't have, many lectures prepared. I'm hoping we can do something, dynamic as we go, but I will say a few things to this point. I think the best way to understand this is to think of an axiom in geometry. It's a starting point. If you're going to prove something, you have to start with something. You can't start with nothing. And so the idea of a self-evident truth is something that is a starting point. Again, you can't do political thinking and start with nothing. Now, this idea of a self-evident truth originally by Jefferson was sacred and undeniable. And it was Franklin that actually changed it in his work with Jefferson to self-evident. Now, if you think about why we should think this is axiomatic, Jefferson tells us, so that when he reflects on the Declaration later, toward the end of his life, and he's asked about it, he says that it was an expression of the American mind, which I think was certainly the case. Of course, not all Americans would have believed it in the way that it was put into practice in seceding. But he also says that he was harmonizing the sentiments of the day, which again, a reflection of the American mind, Also, he says it reflected the elementary books of public right. Now, a lot of people want to make the Declaration something very radical and modern. But when Jefferson lists the elementary books of public right, he goes back to Aristotle and Cicero. In other words, he goes back to a Greek and a Roman. And then he goes to Locke and Sidney. So as far as Jefferson is concerned, this is the ideas in the Declaration, although many of them reflected something contemporary, more or less contemporary, which was British constitutionalism. As far as Jefferson was concerned, they were long-standing political ideas, which had never really been in dispute, and they were the foundation of all political reasoning.
So the way I would think of this is, I think the ideas of the Declaration of Independence are self-evident that all people have certain rights, because you have to ask, well, what if that weren't true? What's the alternative, and where's the burden of proof? Like, if people don't own themselves and basically have the right, at least, or the presumption that people have the right to do whatever they want, unless there's some compelling reason otherwise. So basically, I can do anything I want, and the government can't tell me what to do, except in certain exceptions or situations that we can specify. Because the alternative is absurd. If I don't have the right to control my own life, who does? If I don't own myself, who does own me? And if that person owns me, well, why do they own me? Like, why does the king own me? How is the idea that the king owns me more self-evident than the idea that I own myself? So, it said like possession is 9/10 of the law. Like, you assume that anything is owned by the person who's holding it in their hand until you prove that someone else owns it. And of course you go to court and you present whatever proofs you want. And so I'd say, so if we start with that assumption, I think that's the most easily defensible assumption. And there's a quote I really like. It was from the English Civil War in, actually a bit later. It was the leveler, Richard Rumbold, when he was facing execution, that he was a radical in England. And he said, "I am sure there was no man born marked of God above another, for none comes into the world with a saddle on his back, nor any booted and spurred to ride him." So it's just a self-evident presumption. Every person owns themselves until proven why there should be an exception to that.
Is this working? Yeah, I think just to build on this point, I think the important thing from the self-evident truths and rights is this idea that building on natural rights, everyone in and of themselves being a human being has these rights. They're born with them. They're innate. They're not given to us by government, which is really important. A lot of times governments think they're bestowing things on people, and the Declaration makes very clear multiple times it talks about the consent of the governed, and it turns things on its head from what a lot of people, a lot of societies previously ran on, this idea that rulers allow certain things. And I think what's radical about the Declaration of Independence is flipping that around and saying, no, we have these rights, and it's the government that needs our consent and not vice versa. And I think that's the question we have to keep asking ourselves and reminding government of is, hey, maybe we're not happy with what you're doing, and this country's based on you doing what we want you to. And I think that's something we have to continue to ask. But again, it's this culmination of this direction of Western philosophical tradition. As was previously mentioned, Aristotle, even things like the Magna Carta checking the power of government. It took a long time to get to this point, and you have this remarkable amount of minds all at one place at one time saying, look, we need to balance things out. And this is an aspirational document that we have to keep returning to and saying, look, we have a lot of grievances. And if you look at that now, there are always going to be a lot of grievances against government. We have to keep checking it because it's trajectory towards greater freedom that kind of ties it all together. And I think that makes it's very clear from this point.
Thank you.
Dale, and just add,
Yes.
yeah, the quote that Professor Makovi used, Jefferson uses that same phrase later when he speaks of the Declaration, and he denies the presumption that some men are born with saddles on their back and others born booted and spurred to ride them. And I think Professor Makovi made an essential point, is that part of the self-evident truth is what would be the alternative, and the assertion of agency is a way of making that right self-evident. You know, kind of like where Descartes of this. There's this joke. You know, Descartes is famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am," and the way he gets there is he goes through this long reasoning. Do I exist? Do I not exist? And then he says, whether I think I exist or I do not think I exist, I continue to exist, because obviously you'd have to exist to question your own existence, right? I mean, so there's like a self-evident thing, right? And the joke is the student comes in and asks the professor, you know, I've been reading Descartes all night. You know, he's clearly had a rough night. Please tell me I exist. And the professor's response is, who wants to know? So, you know, that's an example. You know, to Michael's point, you know, what would be the alternative, and that sentiment about being booted and spurred, that's all that lingers with Jefferson, and he carries that forward. There's another expression from the English Civil War, which many of the founders were quite fond of, which is resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. So that's another one that carries over. So when you're looking at the Declaration, you're seeing things from 100 years before that. And if you were to go back to the English Civil War, you would find things that they were echoing from 100 years before that. So again, this continuity. Anyone else?
Actually, that resistance to tyrants is obedience to God reminds me of one interesting thing. So, you know, it's been said a lot of the American Revolution had ties to like John Locke, but there was also a lot of ties in like Reformation Christian thinking and like Calvinism that also tied in. One interesting, there was something called the Geneva Bible, passed by some of the first reformers, and there was a commentary in it that was scandalous to the King of England at the time, that when it says the midwives disobeyed Pharaoh in saving the children, a footnote said the midwives were correct and Pharaoh was wrong. And the king found that absolutely scandalous. How dare you declare that the king of Egypt was wrong? Because the King of England recognized if Pharaoh could be wrong, I can be wrong too. And just something as simple as that was politically revolutionary to people of the time.
Okay, wonderful observations. Now, another place in the Declaration states that in order to secure these self-evident rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. How has this idea reflected and shaped the way that Americans think about the role of government in our society? Again, we'll start with Dr. Moots.
So this is probably the point at which we're foreshadowing some of the other questions that that we'll get to. How extensive was the franchise? In other words, how many people could vote at the time of the Declaration? Well, it was pretty narrow compared to what it is now. And of course, one of the things the Declaration does is it becomes a lever for moving things, so to speak, in politics. We'll talk about that later. So I don't think we should read this as everybody gets to vote for everything. But rather the idea is, and Professor Makovi mentioned, maybe Professor Decker did too, John Locke, okay? And Locke, in his famous second treatise, John Locke was actually a physician by training who becomes a great political philosopher. A lot of his works were published anonymously at the time because they were essentially, contrary to, at least the thinking of the monarchy at the time. But Locke uses a phrase, salus populi suprema lex. And that means the good of the people is the highest law. Okay, so there was an obligation on the part of those ruling to rule in the interests of the people. Now, Did that mean that the interests of the people could only be understood through their direct expression? No, not necessarily. So that might have been it. It might not have been it. So I think the idea of the consent of the governed could be direct representation. It could be indirect representation, as certainly was at issue in the American War for Independence, or at least before the war, the question of whether Americans were represented in Parliament. Of course, you did have legislatures in the colonies, and those were an expression of the consent of the governed. Another expression of the consent of the governed, which we just talked about, was the possibility of those who represented the people interposing themselves against other rulers for the sake of the people, which didn't mean that you had a popular uprising. It meant that you had people acting on behalf of the people. The First Continental Congress, for example, was an expression of this. Now, how many Americans represented the authority of the First Continental Congress? Not all of them. Maybe not even a majority of them. Hard to say. How many people would have called for a constitution to replace the articles? That was another point, which was probably not popular. Okay. In fact, it was done very much in secret. So I wouldn't read this as something that is, incredibly democratic. I think rather what it speaks to is that the purpose of the government is to rule in the interests of the people. It has no other right and no other basis. That's why even when you go back to, the Greeks and the Romans, the idea of tyranny is one who abuses their office or one who acts contrary to the law.
So building on that, I think unfortunately the basic idea of consent to the governed has been almost completely forgotten and lost in the United States today, because people now kind of believe in what Herbert Spencer called a divine right of Parliament. Today it would be Congress, but they basically replace the divine right of the king with the divine right of Congress. And they say, oh, whatever Congress passes as law, that's the law. And, majority rule, 51% of the people, should rule the other 49%. Well, the original conception was no, democracy was a means. The idea of consent to the governed was the government serves on our behalf, but it is not necessarily democratic. Now, democracy was the best system that was yet known. It's been said that democracy is the worst of all systems except for all the other ones. So, we don't want 51% of the people ruling 49, but we also don't want one dictator ruling. So fine, majority rule is the best system we've yet discovered. But the first line of defense was the doctrine of enumerated powers. It was in the Constitution we list, here's exactly the things the federal government can do. And anything it does not say the federal government can do, it cannot do it. So think about, for example, the First Amendment. The whole idea of the First Amendment is even if 99.999% of people vote to infringe the freedom of speech, the federal government can't do it because the Constitution trumps majority rule. Your rights trump majority rule. Majority rule is only the second stage. Once we've passed the hurdle of the government has the legitimate power to do this, well, now exactly how are we going to do it? Well, we're going to do it in the way that 51% of the people want it done because that's the best we can think of. And so think about how to almost today, we never ask what is in the Constitution or what is in the enumerated powers. Think about this. Alcohol prohibition in the United States required a constitutional amendment. We recognize there's no power of the federal government to ban alcohol until you amend the Constitution. Now, should that have been done? No, alcohol prohibition was a horrible failure. But at least they went through the process. They amended the Constitution. Today, heroin and, cocaine are banned. Should they be banned? Maybe, maybe not. But no attempt has ever been made to amend the Constitution to ban, how do we have, the war on drugs in the United States with absolutely nothing in the Constitution warranting it? Or, for example, the Interstate Commerce Clause says, okay, the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. Well, that's been expanded into an enormous blank check. Wickard versus Filburn in 1942, the Supreme Court ruled that the law said that the law was regulating how wheat was grown as part of agricultural price supports to restrict the supply of grain in order to raise the price and grant extra profits to farmers. One of the worst policies we have. So This farmer said, well, wait, I'm growing wheat on my own farm for my own purposes. I'm not selling it to anyone. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, but by growing your own wheat for yourself, you're affecting the wheat that's available for everyone else to buy. Therefore, you're affecting interstate commerce. Well, by that standard, literally everything affects interstate commerce. So it's been transformed into a blank check where, at least apparently, the federal government can do literally anything in the universe, because literally anything, I mean, I guess like putting people in concentration camps, I guess, would affect interstate commerce. So, I mean, I suppose by that standard, I guess the federal government can commit genocide because that would affect interstate commerce. I mean, obviously no one says that, but I mean, that's what the blank check would mean anything. So I think at this point, no one today, like we talk about the procedural parts of the Constitution, when are elections held? What's the power of Congress versus the power of the president versus the Supreme Court? Those purely procedural things we still keep, but the substantive part of the Constitution, what are the actual specific things the federal government can and cannot do and why? We basically pay no attention whatsoever to that at all. And as I said, I would say one of the best brief expressions of this I've seen is there's a Cato Institute edition of the Constitution that has a great introductory essay that describes exactly how the doctrine of enumerated powers was meant to work. And I'm pretty sure if you go on the Cato Institute's website, I think they'll mail it to you for free. So that's the best essay I've seen in like 10 or 20 pages to describe exactly what the Constitution was meant to be and what it is not anymore today.
That's a great point. And this idea of the Constitution and the values in the Declaration serving as guardrails to what is allowable is super important. There was this stunning example when Obamacare was kind of rushed through during sort of Christmas recess. Democrats had lost power in Congress, so they knew they had to get this done before the new Congress took over in January. So they pushed through Obamacare, and a reporter asked, Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House at the time, and a reporter, it was stunning. I was in Washington then, and a reporter said, well, how does this fit in the Constitution? The Speaker of the House, she laughed, and she said to the reporter, are you serious? Just asking for, how does this work with the Constitution? So this idea of the consent of the governed, do we have guardrails on what Congress can and can't do, I think is a sort of preeminent question. Jefferson, kind of this, we'll see if we talk about him more later, had this kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde personality. One of the things he said, though, that was important or wrote was the earth is for the living. And this idea that each generation has to look at things and tinker around with it to make sure this trajectory towards greater liberty is still alive. I think one of the ironies right now is in the UK, right, this country we separated from, there's a disagreement now. The final 292 life peers in the House of Lords are getting kicked out. And I think what's interesting about that is this idea of hereditary peerage being kicked out of the upper body in Parliament. And the question now related to this consent of the governed is, do our representatives now, if you look at the House of Representatives, but particularly the Senate, they're basically life jobs. They're almost life peerages in themselves. Are people really representing our interests anymore? Most members of, not the Senate, most people go to the Senate as millionaires already. The House of Representatives, most people don't get elected to the lower body as millionaires, but they become millionaires in Congress. And how does that happen? How does it happen legitimately? Having worked in Congress, there's no legitimate way to do it other than the laws they make don't apply to themselves. And there's a big corrupting influence on that. What's the body that overlooks if members of Congress break the law? What's a House Ethics Committee? Well, it's probably the only bipartisan committee in Congress because it works out well for both sides. Are these people looking out for our interests? Well, you just look at the current debate over voter ID law. 80% of the country supports it. Neither party manages to get it done. How can an 80 or 85% issue not get passed? And I think that's a pretty important question. When I worked in Congress, it was common when we were writing laws, you'd have members of lobby groups writing in the room writing laws with you. What you didn't have is voters and regular citizens in the room. So this sort of detachment from the consent of the governed. If you have a permanent ruling elite, which we have now, right? Incumbency is whatever incumbency is. It's 85%, 95%, whatever, almost impossible to kick an incumbent out of office. Are they really taking care of the voter of the average citizen? I think the idea is, or I think the answer is clearly at this point not. So we have to kind of revisit this and kind of keep pushing a little more. I think one thing I find promising about Gen Z is there's both the left and right and in that generation, they kind of feel like they've been left holding the bag. And they're skeptical of government the most in my life, I think. And hopefully that leads to good things, right? This idea of expecting more. We have to push to have more freedom and push to make sure people supposedly representing us actually do. So I think it's just a reminder of the grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence. Look, the king or parliament, as the case may have been, are trampling on our rights. They don't care what we want. That's a question that's still relevant, and a question we still, like, if the Declaration's still important, it means we still have to push back. And I think it's as relevant now as ever.
So what I heard in answer to that question was the principle is there, but in practice, it leaves a lot to be desired. And perhaps there's some things that the current generation could do to better honor that idea. So maybe we can come back to that if we have more time. The third question I have for you is, since we have been through incredible transformation since the time of the founding, what events can you point to in our history when the Declaration of Independence served as a guide and or inspiration to Americans as they navigated these transformations?
I'll give you a short list without much fleshing out. The abolitionists in the 19th century used the Declaration. Frederick Douglass, the great Frederick Douglass, used the Declaration. Again, as I said before, this was a lever, to move politics. The 1848 Declaration of Sentiments, go look it up. It's a call for women's rights. It's essentially word for word the Declaration of Independence, with the exception of some changes so that the enumerated grievances are enumerated grievances against women. And there's a few small tweaks. For example, I won't get into that, but here and there. Lincoln uses the Declaration, of course, in opposing Dred Scott, which denied the humanity of freed slaves, uses it in the Gettysburg Address. And of course, the great Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King, uses it. So it comes up again and again, and it was also used. It's also been used around the world in various movements for political independence.
So yeah, I was going to mention, I think abolitionists as well. I think that's you read a lot of the slavery abolitionist tracts. Now, I mean, I'm sure there's, with almost anything, you can find philosophers saying a million different things, and I cannot claim to have read everything there's ever written. So I'm sure you can find some abolitionists who have not said it, I'm about to say. But it's remarkable how many of them basically echo the language of the Declaration of Independence or Locke or other free market type arguments. They basically said, it's always been said a person owns their own body, they own the fruit of their own labor. A person has the right to produce what they want and then sell it for what they want at a price that they want, or work for who they want and not work for who they want. Freedom of contract flows from the freedom of your own labor. And they basically said, well, all that applies to Black people. We're people too, and they basically said everything that's ever been said about white people and the freedom of labor, just apply it to Black people too. So it was a very limited government, pro-private property, pro-market argument for slavery abolition. And so, yes, the Declaration of Independence was used as that lever of, instead of saying, hey, obviously the United States did a lot of horrible things wrong. Obviously, the United States was not a free society as we would understand it. But what they said was not, hey, this failed. The Declaration of Independence didn't work. Black people were slaves. Therefore, let's scrap the whole thing. It was, the ideas were right. The implementation was completely wrong. let's go carry out those ideas the way they should have been carried out in the first place. Free markets have worked great for white people. Let's have them for black people too. Not instead of saying, it's as opposed to, I feel like some people nowadays, there's arguments of like, oh, the United States was flawed from the beginning. Free markets benefited white people, but not black people. Like, therefore, we should scrap the Declaration, scrap the Constitution, scrap free markets, and have some sort of non-constitutional government or non-market, socialism or something. And it's like, so you're saying what worked for white people, we should scrap it and not have it for black people either? Like, not have it for women. Like, hey, what works for men, what made America a great place for men, let's make it a great place for women too. All the ways that private property and free markets served one group of the population, let's make it serve everyone.
There's a largely forgotten but fascinating debate in the 1890s over the role of America's position abroad. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was a turning point for this country in that very short war. The Spanish galleons still had wood ships and things, and it didn't last very long. But we acquired a bunch of colonial possessions at that time, and there's this argument based on the Declaration of our role abroad. If we is a republic, are we losing our focus on rights as we expand into an empire? And there was a bunch of back and forth. Kipling, this sort of British colonial famous writer, had a poem that, the title doesn't necessarily translate well today, but it's called The White Man's Burden. But the idea of the poem was, look, Britain's getting tired trying to extend civilization around the world, try to tamp down things in different places. America needs to sort of pick it up. It's this growing industrial power. The ideas of freedom that America espouses have a lot of resonance. So it's time for America to start to be less introspective and start looking outward and take its responsibility in world leadership. And the Kipling poem's really famous. What's less well known now is Mark Twain wrote a very long response, and it was based on the Declaration of Independence, saying, look, we're supposed to be promoting freedom at home, liberty at home. We're not supposed to be taking over and ruling foreign people and foreign lands. And he was echoing not only the Declaration, but a lot of what Washington said about going and looking for monsters to slay or whatever that was. So you have this Kipling versus Twain argument. And I think it's still a question today, very relevant today, if you look at what is the role of the United States. And there was a book called The Leviathan State. It came out in the 1990s sometime. I think it was written by a Cato Fellow or something like that.
Robert Higgs?
Yeah.
Crisis in Leviathan?
Yeah, right. And the idea was every time there's a war or the expansion of the military industrial complex, rights are chiseled away over time. So I think it's a fair question now. Or anytime it looks like we might get into another long extended war, is there this conflict between the rights we assume we have in a republican form of government versus this sort of imperial power? I mean, right, the obvious classical example is Rome, right? The transition from a republic to an empire in Rome and what that meant for the rights of citizens. Does it apply here? I think the counterbalance to that question, which I think is also extremely relevant, is, and I lived in China for a long time, in the vacuum of American power, who takes our place? And I think that's sort of the counterbalance to this anti-imperial conversation. China's sort of next on deck. And if American power is replaced by Chinese power, the world's definitely a worse place. So, what does that mean? Where do we find that balance between extending our power abroad, trying to keep things in check? We do live in a world order that we created largely after World War II. Even if we don't like it, we sort of created it. It's very expensive, right? The British Empire ran out of money because of a couple world wars, and their colonial possessions end up being more expensive to maintain than they were to generate revenue. well, we have 40 trillion in debt. Some estimates are actually 100 trillion in debt. How do we make this work? And I think that's sort of this, but you go back to that debate over the Spanish-American War and taking over Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, a bunch of other possessions. Was that admission creep? And I think that's something we have to continue to ask.
So really quick, so yeah, that reminded me, there's actually also an interesting essay. I think it was Auberon Herbert, if I remember. I think he wrote an essay, something like The Conquest of America by Spain. And he basically says in the Spanish-American War, it was Spain that won because their ideas of empire took over the American mind. And we won the war, but they won the ideas and we've become them. And then like with Crisis in Leviathan, so it's this book by Robert Higgs, he refers to it as a ratchet effect. You know, you turn a ratchet and then you turn it back, but the screw doesn't turn back. So he says every time we start a war, either a literal war or something like, let's say, the New Deal was, you know, the war on the Great Depression, or Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, you start this massive expansion of government to solve a social problem, and it never comes back if the problem is solved. That like you create a whole new alphabet soup of government agencies and you never step it back. And so he explains how the American government has grown over time. And then there's recent work by Chris Coyne and Abigail Hall about what they call the boomerang effect, where they say every time we start a foreign war or a foreign imperial exercise, it eventually comes back to America. They note, for example, how many domestic police operations now use equipment and tactics first used by the American military abroad. And like now you see like local police actually drive like surplus military equipment. So they basically say, regardless of what you think about the rights of the foreigners, know that anything we ever do to foreigners, we're going to eventually do it to American citizens too.
Well, it's obvious from your answers looking backward that the Declaration was much more than just some fine sentiments written to impress the world and then be forgotten. It has had a major influence on the way we think about ourselves, and it has shaped our past. The next question, though, asks us to look towards the future as we continue to change with AI and other technologies transforming our lives. Is it possible we will grow out of the ideas expressed, or that we will need new ideas to guide us into this future?
Short answer, no. I think one of the worst things you can do is think of yourself as exceptional. You have nothing to learn. The past has nothing to teach us. And I think one of the worst things we can do right now is think that, you look, for example, at the internet, you read what was said about the internet when it came out. You look at what's actually happening on the internet and to the internet. There's a phrase, I'll give you the clean version. It's called crapification. And when you read essays on this, it's startling just, how much we've learned about what this tool is going to be for. Now, my point here is not about AI. My point is that initial impression of exceptionalism, which causes us to forget what must be remembered. So I think the best answer to the question is the answers we just got to the last question, which is how much we have yet to learn rather than just how smart we are.
Yeah, and I would say far from saying, oh, the world is more complicated or advanced or whatever, we don't need the Declaration anymore. I would say, no, we need to go back and relearn both the Declaration and the Constitution, all those lessons that I think we originally knew and have forgotten. So just for example, like recently the Supreme Court ruled that the president is largely immune from conviction for a variety of things. So basically, well, he's immune for conviction of things done in the process of his official duties as president. Well, what are his official duties? They didn't say, so it's almost everything. So, as some of the justices point out, well, what if the president orders as president for the military to go assassinate a political opponent? Is that done as part of his official role as president? He is the commander in chief of the army. So if he orders the army to assassinate someone, then he's apparently acting as president. So as Justice Sotomayor said, the relationship between the president and the people he serves has shifted irrevocably. In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. So I'd say no, and they said, oh, it's in the national interest, for example, that the president not be bogged down by lawsuits. And I'd say, no, it depends on what the national interest. If the national interest is the interest of the government, then yeah, I guess it's the interest of the political powers to not be burdened by accountability to the people. Yeah, the president's interest as president is to do anything he wants. I'd say our interest as the people, which is that what is the national interest, the interest of the government of the people? I don't know. But our interest as the people, I'd say, is to bog the president down in as many lawsuits as it takes for him to not violate the law. And I don't just say that about the current president. I would say that about every president we've ever had and every will have. And you have to remember, never give power to your friend if that power might ever be used by your enemy. No matter how much you like the current president, never give him any power that you would not want to see be exercised by whoever's going to come after him. So, and if, you know, and the same thing, I would say no one should have ever given President Biden power that they wouldn't want to see exercised by President Trump. No one should give President Trump power they wouldn't want to be succeeded by whoever is going to be the next Biden. So we should learn that and say, no, we need to limit power more. And if the Constitution Declaration did not limit the power enough, we should take the lesson and say, okay, the lesson was good, the thinking was good, they just didn't take it far enough. Right? Say, like right now, for example, we're seeing, well, as you mentioned, that Congress is in charge of enforcing itself. The Department of Justice is headed by the president. So the president is in charge of investigating and prosecuting himself. Maybe we should think, what if we had an independent fourth branch of government, you know, as an extra check and balance on power? Maybe it would be some independent branch of government whose job would be to prosecute and investigate all the other branches of government. Or maybe the Supreme Court should be given its own prosecutors and police power so that it's someone other than Congress and the president in charge of investigating themselves. And that we need to at least think creatively of what are more ways we can, as Thomas Jefferson said in the Kentucky Resolution of 1789, he said, in questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. Meaning it's not enough to vote for the right people. You have to set the rules of the game. You have to set up a good umpire. Don't trust the players of the game to play the game according to the rules. Make a good umpire who's able to drop the gauntlet and enforce those rules. And then you will have a good game being played.
Are we going to grow out of the Declaration of Independence? I don't think so, but I think largely we've forgotten it and don't think about it anymore already. And I think, you know, one of the special things about Northwood, obviously, is the Northwood idea, and leaning heavily into, you know, free enterprise, limited government, individual responsibility, and these types of things. Americans largely forgetting or not considering the Declaration of Independence or these values espoused in the Northwood idea. It's partially we have an educational why is the Northwood idea so unique and so special? Because 99% of universities teach the exact opposite, and they kind of espouse this sort of hate America first, or, you know, hate America ideology. And teachers unions in public schools largely emphasize that too, right? This sort of revisionist history of America's wrong, Western history overall is this saga of persecution and horrible things, and it ignores all the wonderful things of opportunity and freedom that came out of the West and especially out of American history. So looking forward, do we grow out of it? I think the danger is we have people that don't know anything about it at all, so it doesn't come into play anymore. And how do you wrestle back an educational establishment that actually hates what America is and sort of teaches young people to actually think that this country has a negative influence on the world and on history, instead of being this sort of remarkable example of an experiment in freedom? And I think that's kind of the danger. And I think it's really, really pressing right now. You know, you look at this push for supposedly free things, you know, free education, free college, free healthcare. Well, obviously nothing's free. Everything costs something, but there's this growing demand of sort of gimme, gimme, gimme. And there's less focus on what's our responsibility. So I think we're losing focus of these ideas of freedom that are enshrined in the Declaration. If you look at the Declaration, we're being limited in all these ways by a foreign power to do what we want to do. And now I think a lot of people would give up freedom for more stuff. And I think that's sort of a big threat. So I think will we grow out of it? No, I think we're gradually just forgetting about it. And I think there needs to sort of be a rebirth of understanding. How we do that with schools, I think it's very difficult. Hopefully it starts here and expands from there.
So the final question for our panel is about today's polarized politics, with fierce disagreement about the proper role of government and the limits on government from the right and the left. Does the Declaration still provide common ground that can unite Americans on both sides so that they can begin to resolve their differences, or are these principles themselves the source of our differences? Do we disagree about those principles today?
I think, or I'd like to think, that most Americans still believe in America. They still believe in the promise of America. They still believe in the American system of government. Unfortunately, there's a disproportionate attention paid to what I'll call the radical left and the reactionary right. And the reactionary right is just the other side of the same coin. I would love for Americans to argue about who's a better American. That would be great. What I'm seeing instead, and this is again among the more radical and reactionary elements, is how many things are wrong with America. That started on the left, and now it's just a mirror image on the right. And again, I think the best thing to do, I would love for us to contend about exactly what rights we have and how they should be exercised responsibly and how the rule of law can protect them. I would love for that to be the case. I would love for us to have a good argument about that. Instead, we seem to be having an argument about how to abandon that system, which I think has served us in good stead for a long time. So whatever you can do to contribute to that, not the problem, the solution, please do.
Well, I think a big problem is so often, I think both sides of the political spectrum or both parties say the same thing, but they claim to be saying different things. So I think a lot of good ideas end up being disparaged because the people who claim to espouse that idea are actually doing the opposite. As one 19th century economist Frederick Bastiat said, nothing is so harmful to a good cause as to be badly defended. So, for example, speaking very broadly here, you could say, let's say the left has all sorts of terrible anti-free market arguments, for example, and that, okay. But then what happens on the right wing? Well, for example, currently we have a wide variety of new import taxes and tariffs on foreign trade done without any legal basis. And so now it's the parties supposedly of the free market, the Republicans, that are doing some of the most anti-market activities. Actually, in the Declaration of Independence, one of the grievances against England, it says, for cutting us off with world trade. One of the reasons why the United States became the United States was to not have import tariffs and restrictions on international trade. So I think part of that, what happens is, like, the right wing claims to be pro-free market. They do anti-market things. And then the left says, well, okay, if that's what capitalism is, if capitalism is, for example, serving big businesses and elites and corruption and cronyism, well, then we don't want capitalism. Well, no, that's not what capitalism, like, being pro-market does not mean being pro-particular business. I defend the competitive market process, not any particular competitor. And if, for example, a foreign company produces a better product at a lower price than an American company, consumers should be able to buy the foreign product that's cheaper and better. Because first off, that's your individual right as a person to buy what you want and sell what you want. Like, we don't trade with foreign countries. We trade with foreign people. It's just a foreign company of flesh and blood people. And you as a flesh and blood person are trading with this flesh and blood person who happens to live in another country. So first, that's your right to buy and sell with them. But also, economists almost universally believe that is one of the sources of economic growth. Like, economists argue on a lot of things, but almost every economist across the spectrum, left to right, says international free trade is a good thing. So it's both economically good and, like, I guess, freedom, individual rights, good. So the right engages in corruption, engages in cronyism, subverts free markets, distorts free markets, favors corruption and cronyism. And like I said, then the left says, oh, if that's what free markets are, we want the opposite. Or as Frederick Bastiat, again, he observed in the 19th century, he said, we have socialism, he said, for the rich. So he says, so what do the poor do? They say the poor say, well, if the rich get to have socialism, then the poor deserve socialism too. And so he says they're both he says basically the rich and the poor are both arguing for the same thing. They both want the government to control their lives. It's just a question of control people's lives on behalf of whom. And no one is saying, he said, let's let people be free and maybe no one's life should be controlled. So I think the more we recognize that, both parties are arguing for the same thing and they're both wrong.
I think one of the problems largely pushed by social media, this fixation on division, is it kind of tempts people to lose hope that you can fix things. Like, oh, everyone hates each other, we can't work together, so the country's over, right? Talk of a civil war and things like that. What this neglects is that we've been divided from the beginning and divided in some very serious ways, but we found a way to muddle along and keep improving our system and our society, right? We talk about the Declaration of Independence. We're talking about freedom. We had huge disagreements at the time, right? Slavery is an obvious example. Well, we're talking about freedom and we own slaves. We had a lot of disagreement at that time. And what did the founders decide to do? Well, let's punt and figure it out later, right? But let's get started and start working on it, because this is an aspirational vision to keep moving towards greater freedom. So this idea that we're not perfect now, well, we never were, and we always had lots of divisions, punting on slavery sort of at the Declaration and during the constructing the Constitution. Well, I mean, it was less than a century later that 600,000 Americans were killed sort of trying to settle that issue, right? 10 times more than were killed in Vietnam, right? In a dramatically smaller population. So being fixated on our division now, well, that was a pretty divided time. You had, a member of Congress on the House floor beating another member of Congress into coma with a cane. Well, that's pretty divided. Maybe we should have Fight Club in Congress now, make it more interesting or whatever. But I think this idea of kind of losing hope, I think we have to remember that one of the amazing things about the American people, and I think it's partially this collection of people from all over the world trying to figure things out together, there is this sort of amazing self-correcting ability in this country that other countries don't have. Even if you look at the pendulum swing in elections, what traditionally happens, the president's elected, usually gets a majority of both Congresses, because people are like, oh, great, let's try the new guy. And then what happens after about a year and a half, everyone's like, oh my gosh, we don't want the whole government being run by one party. So usually in the midterm election, 2 years into a president's term, what usually happens, at least one house goes to the opposition party. And what is that? Americans are very uncomfortable with one side having too much power, and ends up blending to sort of this natural self-correction. So, and the system's right. The system is obviously composed with that in mind, just like the separation of powers and the checks and balances in government. So I think with social media, how do you get right? Clicks and likes come from negativity. How do we counterbalance that? I think that is one of the dangers of the future. But I think it's always important to remember that we were seriously divided in the past, and we've made it this far. Republics don't tend to last long, so 250 years is a pretty good run. I think what the Second French Republic lasted 4 years or something like that.
Indeed, 250 years is a great run, and I think it's been a great way to kick off our celebration of it. I want to thank all the members of our panel. I also want to say I could have listened a lot longer to each of you. I envy our students who get to spend an entire semester in your classes. I also want to put a good word out. If you're interested in the topics discussed by the panel today, next fall, there's a special class. The Freedom Seminar next fall will be focusing on the impact of the Declaration and its ideas on American history. It's led by Professor Moeller. So as you register for your classes this semester for next year, keep that particular class in mind. And I certainly want to thank you all for your support of this event. And now I will call Dr. Fairbairn back up here for some final remarks.
Thank you so much. I don't know about you, but my heart is full. It is full of pride for our country, our amazing country. But almost more importantly, it is full of pride for our university. I think that was just a knockout job. So a big round of applause to Dr. Matcheck and to our amazing panelists, Dr. Moots, Dr. Makovi, and Dr. Decker. Thank you so, so much. I think it so perfectly reminded us that the ideas of the Declaration are not behind us and that they are still shaping our understanding of what freedom means, what responsibility means, and what how government is, what it means to us and how we live our day every day. So thank you so much. We invite you to continue the celebration today, the Freedom Lights the Future celebration. So those of you on campus, it is probably close, it is exactly 11 o'clock. So we invite you to move on to the Mall Walk and the Four Seasons, where there is a curated museum exhibit. There are historical reenactors you can connect with and take pictures with. Benjamin Franklin, Abigail Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton. Students, we encourage you to participate in the pop-up contest competition, where you can translate passages from the Declaration of Independence into current day vernacular. And win the winner earns a trip to Washington, D.C., to the National Archives Museum, where you can see firsthand the Declaration of Independence. So we encourage you to do that. At noon and at 1 o'clock, we have a Revolutionary War Militia unit who will be demonstrating their muskets and firing those off without real ammunition or anything like that. So don't worry about that. And then tonight, the culminating event is the free concert. And we have these flyers with a QR code where we encourage you to sign up. It'll make much more easy access when you go to the Hawk Center tonight. And again, that's Jedi Mind Trip. And we have two of our own students, Braden Leap and Steeler Leap, who are doing performances. So we encourage you to go and support them. It is sure to be a grand time. And so please register online. Is there anything I'm missing, Kate? Did I hit everything? Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you again to the panel and Dale. That was so spectacular. Have a great day and hope to see you on the Mall Walk.